Hi, and welcome to the Collector's Edge for Nordic Art Partners. In today's episode, we will explore the career and market of Josef Albers, one of the most influential abstract artists and color theorists of the 20th century. Joining me, as always, is our art expert, Nicholas Robinson, and I'm your host, Jeppe Kurt. Let's get started.
It is with Alex Rotter at 400 million. Selling here at Christie's, $400 million is the bid, and the piece is sold.
We've all heard about it. Sometimes it's front page news. Important works of art are being sold for incredible sums of money. But can you get involved and become a part of the exclusive club yourself? And how do you get started while avoiding buying the wrong things? That's exactly what this podcast is about. This is The Collector's Edge from Nordic Art Partners, a podcast for those of you interested in the mechanics of the art industry, want advice about putting money into art, or simply want to buy something for your walls to beautify your surroundings. Whatever your objectives, it is possible to put money into art wisely, to be considered, thoughtful, and well-informed in your choices and actions. Welcome to the art of collecting, with an eye for curated beauty and practical value.
Hi, Nick.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you today?
I'm good. And especially because we're going to talk about Josef Albers.
Yes, we have
Nick,
a lot to get through. He's obviously a towering figure.
Yeah, exactly. But Nick, normally we usually talk about artists who are either rising or rediscovering, but Josef Albers is different. He feels different, right? He's already in every museum. He's in every art history book. So why are we using our time and talking about him today?
Well, I think it's possible for an artist to have all of these credentials and yet somehow still be underrated. And we are going to talk about just why we think that is the case. There's a lot of different kinds of works that he made and lots of different kinds of opportunities that it presents for people who are interested in collecting one of the unquestionably most significant figures in the history of modernism and 20th century art.
Yes, good. And also you probably need some deep pockets this time to get at Josef Albers. But let's get back to that.
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah, exactly. As always, let's start how we usually do by go backwards and talk a little bit about his background.
Certainly we can do that. Where to begin, really? His entire had a very long life, spanning the bulk of the 20th century. And I think, we can, first of all, let's just sort of summarize him and what he's known for, I guess, is maybe a good place to start. The reason why we're talking about him today is that I think myself and many other people would consider him and his work to be the most significant bridge between European and American modernism. In the 20th century, there was a sort of a leap, if you will, taking place in the post-war period where New York assumed sort of primacy, taking over from Paris, which had been the sort of undisputed center of modern art practice, progressive art practice in the earlier part of the 20th century. And Albers is a very important figure who has a seminal role in sort of both of these environments. So that's the first thing. And what he's known for? Well, he's known for spending really an entire career very focused into his sort of investigations into the perceptual properties of color. So it's a very narrow and disciplined approach that he has taken towards his view of art, his ideas about art. But we'll come on to that more in a bit. So to begin, we can rewind back to the very beginning. He was born in 1888 in Prussia. His father was a general contractor and very proficient in all manner of handiwork things necessary to build carpentry, plumbing. So when Albers was a very young boy and a young man, his father was very influential in that he trained Joseph, the young Joseph, in various materials and techniques, teaching him about their properties, how to use them, manipulate them. So a very important practical foundation that Albers always was to fall back on. From 1908 until 1913, he worked as a school teacher. Initially, he was teaching young children as a generalist, but he had a very kind of important sort of seismic event in his life, if you like. In 1908, he saw 2 paintings by Cézanne at the Folkwang Museum in Essen, and this was his first experience of really visiting art, but also more notably of being very viscerally moved by it. And he was always to recall this experience as one that really made him feel that somehow his life had changed forever with this experience. So at the end of this sort of mini period, in 1913, he gained a teaching qualification as an art teacher, and this is when he actually begins to start making art for the first time. In 1919, he enrolled in the Royal Bavarian Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. And interestingly, and this is a little bit why I refer to him as sort of spanning an entire century, because in Munich he was taught by Franz von Stuck. Now, von Stuck was a leading figure in German art at the end of the 19th century, and his style was very strongly associated with the sort of late Romanticism and symbolism of that time. And he, as a teacher, was also to count Paul Klee and Vasily Kandinsky among his students. So this was Albers' first introduction to being taught art at a high level.
So Albers is now a teacher, and this will become a key part of his identity for many years to come.
Well, yes. I mean, his entire life was spent as a teacher, as an educator, and the role he played in that part of his life is of course inseparable from the role he played developing his own work. His teaching was a sort of a vehicle for him to develop and evolve his theories, and then of course his own work was the means by which he performed these theories in a practical sense. So in 1920, this is a very key phase now for Albers. In 1920, he joined the Weimar Bauhaus as a student. Now, the Bauhaus had been founded 1 year previously by Walter Gropius, an architect, a leading modernist architect, one of the very first architects practicing what we describe as the international style, also practiced by, most famously, Le Corbusier in France. So he went to study at the Bauhaus, and he was very interested in working with glass, but there was shortage of materials. There was very high inflation in Germany at the time, and so it was very difficult for him to get his hands on the kinds of things that he wanted to use to incorporate into his work. So he found himself making a sort of assemblage type works from discarded materials, especially glass. He describes process whereby he's sort of breaking old bottles in order to get different colored and shaped shards that he can utilize to incorporate into his work. He also innovated a process of painting on glass that involved sandblasting. But such was his sort of innovative kind of contribution to life in the Bauhaus that he was invited to become a faculty member in 1922. Another key thing happened to him in 1922. He met his future wife, in fact, whose name was shortened to Annie, but her name was Anneliese Fleischmann, the daughter of a well-to-do furniture manufacturer. She was actually initially turned down for entry into the Bauhaus, but Joseph sort of helped her sort of rework and prepare her approach to the admission tests, and eventually she was admitted, and she then went to conduct her studies in the weaving workshop. She would actually subsequently also come to direct the weaving workshop. So in due course, she also followed the same path as Albers, her husband, Joseph, whereby they began life as students, and they were so sort of inextricably intertwined with the life of this place, this institution, that they also came to work there. In 1923, Albers was invited by Gropius to teach the forecourse or the preliminary course, and this is an important sort of foundation course, and the duties of which he shared with another incredibly important artist, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Now, some people mistakenly think of Albers as being a teaching, a sort of a painting teacher, but that's actually not the case. The painting masters at the Bauhaus were Kandinsky and Klee. If you recall his sort of erstwhile other students from the Franz von Stuck years. But these guys were teaching the painting course, and Albers was teaching various other things. He taught design. He was involved in glass. He was involved in. He even designed a chair. Designed some typefaces. So he was very much involved in graphic design. And I suppose we could say that he was involved in all the different sort of aspects that today we come to understand as industrial design, and his early underpinnings from his sort of informal education under the tutelage of his father was very instrumental in his very sort of practical approach to all of these different disciplines. In 1925 was a key year in the Bauhaus. That is when the school moved into their buildings, the famous buildings designed by Gropius, moving from Weimar to Dessau. And in 1925, when this move took place, he was promoted to professor. He married Annie, and the two of them lived in one of the master's residences, Annie continuing in the weaving workshop, and Joseph involved in, like I mentioned, carpentry, metalwork, glass, graphic design. Very much an early proponent of very clean and effective design whereby form would follow function. In terms of his own work at this time, he designed some large-scale windows for a newly built museum, also tableware, in addition to some of the other things that I've already mentioned. So this was a real, possibly the most kind of influential generation of artist educators in the entire 20th century, other than another place, which we will come on to shortly, which Albers was also involved in. But the faculty at the Bauhaus at this time included Paul Klee, Kandinsky, as I mentioned, Oskar Schlemmer, Moholy-Nagy, Marcel Breuer, Johannes Itten, Lionel Feininger, Herbert Bayer, and Marianne Brandt. So this is really a sort of a brains trust of art and design in this early modern period. But this period, sadly, was not to last. We all know, unfortunately, what happened to Germany and what started to happen to Germany at this time. Well, in 1933, the National Socialist government came to power, and the Bauhaus was very much under threat. It was, of course, a very progressive institution, and things that were progressive at this time were considered degenerate by the Nazis. So the school was actually, people think that it was shut down by the Nazis. It's actually not strictly speaking the case. It was closed voluntarily by the faculty, really born from their refusal to comply with the educational dictates, the staffing rules, etc. of the Nazi regime. So at this key time, the Albers were now unemployed and also very much aware of the uncertainty and the problematic implications of Annie being Jewish. So this brings us to a very pivotal moment in their life. So in 1933, Annie met, coincidentally, the young American architect Philip Johnson. She ran into him in Berlin, They had previously met at the Bauhaus, but they were looking at some design work that Annie was showing him in hers and Joseph's house, and he asked her if she wanted to go to America. She talked to Joseph. She determined that yes, they wanted to go to America, but immigration was potentially complicated at this time. But the Albers' reputation as important art theorists and also Annie's friendship with Philip Johnson were to prove instrumental. This was a sort of a key factor in their ability to transition from Europe to the United States. Also, behind the scenes, there were some highly influential patrons making arrangements. Johnson himself was extremely well connected, and probably through him, there came associations with John D. Rockefeller II and his wife, and Edward Warburg. Collectively, they lobbied for their immigration permissions, also paying a first-class steamship fare for them. But the reason that they went to America wasn't just to speculatively, escape from the tumult of Europe. It was because they had a specific thing to go to, and that was to be the founding professors of Black Mountain College. So Black Mountain College was founded in 1933, and it was a liberal arts college in North Carolina that was unique for its educational approach, where an emphasis on art and creativity was the core discipline for all students. And the interesting thing about Black Mountain, which I suppose is a little bit of an analog to the Bauhaus, is that it has developed some of the most seminal and influential American artists of the 20th century, really those who shaped the entire cultural life of the second half of the century across numerous disciplines. So you had Joseph and Annie and their colleagues, the other professors, including the experimental composer John Cage, whose first musical happening took place at Black Mountain, the inventor, the architect, theorist Buckminster Fuller, who was responsible for building the first geodesic dome. He was on the faculty there. Einstein was a guest lecturer there too. And some of the other members of the faculty, either permanent or visiting, Elaine and Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, Aaron Siskind, the leading photographer, was a student initially and then a professor. Robert Motherwell, Merce Cunningham, he formed his dance company there. And then some of the students that Albers was responsible for teaching include some of the most notable artists from the United States, including Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, Ruth Hosour. So anyway, this is a little bit of an overview of Albers as a teacher, and I know it seems like a lot of information, but we can't really overstate how instrumental he was in communicating, his ideas. We're gonna come on to what those ideas consist of, but there's a lot of anecdotal information about his time at Black Mountain. He was very deeply admired and loved as a professor. His English initially was extremely limited, and to begin with, Annie performed translating duties for him. But because his grasp of English was small, his seminars were highly visual, and he was very, gesticulatory and highly encouraging of students to express themselves. So a funny sort of story dating back to this time. His first ever statement as a teacher in English was most likely dictated by his limited grasp of the language. So he was asked what his overriding philosophy or what his, didactic approach was to the course that he would teach. And he replied very simply, to open eyes. So from 33 to 49, he was a teacher at Black Mountain. But by 1949, there were various internal divisions as to the direction of the college. It was becoming a little bit riven with friction and conflict. So that prompted the Albers to leave and move to New York. And that same year, in 49, Annie was the first woman and the first textile artist to have a solo show at the Museum of Modern Art. So that goes to show you, even though they are teachers and educators, that goes to show you the standing that they had. And yes, this pod is about Josef Albers, but I think that we can't speak about one without the other. They were extremely important symbiotically to each other, professionally and personally, and they both, kind of developed alongside each other, encouraged each other, supported each other. But in 1949, they left, and then in 1950, Josef was appointed the head of the newly formed Department of Design at Yale University. So even here, he was not a painting professor, but a professor in the Department of Design. And 1950 is a key year because this is the year that he begins making his homage to the square paintings. But anyway, we will return to this this group of works shortly. But again, we cannot overstate his influence. Even whilst at Yale, there are numerous important alumni that came through the college under his tutelage, including Eva Hesse, Richard Anuskevich, Neil Welliver, a real who's who of late 20th century important artists working in a variety of styles, but all of whom came into contact with him and were deeply touched by his approach to teaching. I'm just going to say one more thing about his teaching philosophy. Is a nice quotation that I found. He said, "I have not taught painting because it cannot be taught. I have taught seeing. What I taught was philosophy of form, the philosophy of lines, the philosophy of colors."
Thank you, Nick. So you have covered his ideas about teaching art. I think we should talk a little bit about making art. What kind of work did he make, and can you give us an overview, maybe also a timeline, and even a description of his painting, maybe his key body of works?
Yes, of course. So, as I alluded to at the beginning, the key theme of his entire working life and teaching life was color. The way color is perceived, and the way chromatic contrasts are perceived, and the way color reacts when placed adjacent to other colors, and how the colors can essentially activate each other in different ways. But his own work, as I've mentioned, he made his glass works at the Bauhaus. His first key works in color were actually made out of glass. He was always very fascinated by the properties of glass, how essentially light could react with and activate the color in glass. And he made some very important gridded works whilst at the Bauhaus, whereby squares of colored glass were arranged in a grid with a sort of soldered metal frame holding these small tiles, rather like a sort of a mosaic almost. In 1934 was when he really started to sort of paint in oils. So, of course, he'd been working as an artist prior to this, but he had been making a lot of sort of object-based works. He and Annie started traveling a little bit, and in 1934 he actually exhibited some woodcut works in Havana. 1936, 37, throughout the 1940s, he started painting on masonite, which was a key material for him throughout his working life. And these works, show a sort of inexorable development towards the homage to the square works that we shall come on to. But these works typically are characterized by line, blocks of color, somewhat constructivist in persuasion, showing different ways that line and color can react together in these very sort of disciplined compositional forms. There are some sort of reminiscences of other practitioners from this time, maybe Ben Nicholson, Naum Garbo, some other artists whose work you can sort of see a little bit in his early paintings. In the late 1940s, he and Annie were to travel to Mexico, which became a very significant place for them. He developed a body of works that immediately preceded the Homage to the Square works, and these are sort of colloquially known as his Adobe works. He was very interested in the architectural vernacular of Mexico, the way that the forms were constructed, the fenestration of the buildings, the repetition of these forms. He actually took huge amounts of photographs of these buildings too, and he started making paintings that were a sort of reductive interpretation of these forms, always in these very sort of flat blocks of color, showing the interplay of color and form. I think I read somewhere they went maybe 13 times by the late 1960s. So anyway, this is this Adobe series that he began in 47 on one of their journeys to Mexico, was actually during a sabbatical from teaching at Black Mountain. He has a sort of quote about this, which is very sort of germane to his Homage series. He said, "All variants are built on an underlying checkerboard-like structure. This provides a definite relationship of all parts and therefore a unification of form. In each painting, the areas of the various colors are in most cases equal. I have deprived myself of great light contrasts. All colors remain on a medium level of intensity. There is no modulation. All color areas are flat and of definite shapes, joining along the contours tightly." By that he means these sort of hard-edged blocks of color butting up against each other. So this is a range of effects, if you like, that he's started to develop that are quite limited in their scope and allow for a certain repetition. And this format excited him. And he actually continued to paint these Adobe works until 1966, at which point his focus to the Homage to the Square took over completely.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So, Homage to the Square works, it seems impossible to look past these big crowning achievements. Tell us about them and maybe also what they mean.
Well, the Homage to the Square became his sort of defining life's work, if you will. He first started making them in 1950 when he took up the teaching position at Yale. And he made them until the end of his life in 1976. So this is a format that he worked on obsessively and, as I mentioned, exclusively after 1966. And if you like, was recognized at the time as the most sort of exhaustive, rigorous study of color in art at this time. And in 1971, this series of paintings, they were the subject actually of the first ever solo show devoted to a living artist at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So anyway, this Homage to the Square, what are they? Well, each is on masonite, which is a kind of a sort of a composite wooden board, and each is painted on the rough side of the material. Each consists of 3 or 4 squares. Now, sometimes people say that they are squares within squares or nested squares. So you basically have 3 or 4 squares set on top of each other, but instead of being arranged centrally. Every single one of these paintings is square as well. The masonite board is square, and the painted squares, the center of the painted squares is actually moved down so that the spaces between the squares are much sort of tighter at the bottom than they are at the top. So this gives them a kind of a little bit of a feeling of movement, so that the squares are sort of activated, or the color becomes sort of animated, or maybe not so static in some way. So anyway, you have 3 or 4 squares. Each of the squares is painted in a different color. And the way he painted was with a palette knife. He always used a palette knife to apply the color. And the reason he used masonite actually is because he was sort of spreading with this knife. It was the firmness of the masonite surface provided a better resistance for the application than a canvas would, which of course is more springy, I guess. So these panels, prior to his painting the colors, they were always covered with at least 6 coats of white primer. And Albers also changed and manipulated the lighting in the studio, and he arranged these above his work table and would sort of modify them to create different patterns of light temperature to try and replicate different times of day or whatever else. So then the process of painting itself, well, as I said, he used the palette knife, and he would use the oil paint that he would squeeze onto the board straight out of the tube. And he would then work from the center outwards, where he would, there's footage of him very meticulously using the sort of side blade of this palette knife up against these lines, and then sort of slowly sort of spreading it out, almost as if he's spreading butter on bread. He used more than 600 varieties of color in these series of paintings. And over the course of this time, from 1950 to 1976, he made more than 1,000 paintings. So the board was laid flat on the table, the lines were drawn, the light was modulated, and then the paint was applied in a single layer, freehand, moving deftly outwards from the center. And this actually was I should say, a very practical way of working. And this is, again, something that he learned from his father. His father taught him as a youngster not to carry wet paint over already painted areas in case of dripping or splashing. So he's sort of moving outwards, so he's not kind of bringing paint over already completed areas. But these lines that he made are from a distance, they kind of appear quite perfect, almost machine-made. But then when you look at them close up, you can see that they're actually not perfect. There's a very clearly the hand of the artist in their making, and they have beautiful, smooth surfaces. Let's see, what are the other distinguishing characteristics of these paintings? He was very obsessive about it, so I guess I feel I should be very clear and accurate about what properties they consist of. Each painting, or more or less each painting, actually lists the materials on the back. So there are descriptions on the back of every panel with the names of the colors that he uses. So this is a very sort of instructive historic document also for scholars. And so that's what they are. But what were they intending to be? What did they mean? Well, for Albers, he felt very strongly that color was the sort of defining thing in our experience of art, that art was really defined by color. And for him, every color has the power to change every other color. So it was really a sort of a search to explore the limitless permutations of how color reacts and activates other colors, and how colors can change depending on which colors you put next to them. You have warmth, you have coldness, you have different emotional or spiritual evocations. He even equated color with different kind of moralities. So for him, color was very much a living, breathing thing. And the thing about the arrangement, you know, the squares. I mean, the squares to Albers were sort of, there's a sort of a paradox about them. They were essential, but to him they were also somehow unimportant, because the squares was not a design unto itself, but really a vehicle to enable to see the color and to see the colors in this way adjacent to each other. So the format really enabled him to continue doing this limitlessly and forever without ever repeating himself. So the concentric squares were really the ultimate vessel to explore his key objective. And he described it thus: when I achieved that, I made you do creative seeing of colors. And this is my real aim, not the paintings. So this repetition, this is really related to his key idea that there is no end to color. The device, the compositional device, he actually described as a prison in which he put the colors. So really, the colors have nowhere to go other than react with each other, come sort of sometimes oscillate a little bit. His work was very influential in terms of the op art movement of the 1960s. And sometimes the colors show that they maybe either sort of recede or they come forwards, depending on these relational qualities between the colors.
Okay, Nick, so why should a collector consider adding Albers' work to their collection? I mean, of course, it makes sense if one is interested in acquiring an important piece of modernist art, but these are hardly a secret. And the fact that Albers' foundation has been represented by David Zwirner for almost a decade suggests that they are probably quite expensive. Is there value here for a collector looking to buy something important that still has potential to grow?
Well, I think so. And that's, of course, why we've arrived at this point. And maybe it seems like a long preamble to discuss his market, but I think that the purpose of describing his working life the way I have done is to really try at least to demonstrate that he is kind of at the epicenter of so many of the key turning points in the 20th century, how modernism developed, how ideas about painting became increasingly reductivist, pared back. Of course, we know the term minimalism very well, but this came from the ideas that people like Albers had, and one of the key people, stripping away to get to the most elemental components of painting in order for painting to somehow not only justify itself, but fulfill its true purpose. So anyway, when we think about Albers in the market, the key thing about his market is that there are lots of these homage to the square paintings. As I said, he made more than 1,000. So there are always opportunities to acquire them. But the good thing about any evolving market is that, of course, they ultimately do get scarcer over time as more and more disappear into collections where they tend to become very, very cherished. And because they're such a milestone of 20th century art, their importance is likely to be increasingly understood rather than become less respected. So my feeling about this body of work is that history will be more and more kind to it, which will tend to, of course, well, that's value in one sense, but then that tends to sort of parlay into value, market value in another sense. So if we look into the some of the key sort of data points of his market, and actually what I should say before I get into that is that there are many different sizes of Homage to the Square paintings. The smallest is 16 by 16 inches, which is more or less 40 or 41 square centimeters. And then the largest is 48 inches square, which is 1.22 meters square. And there's lots of different incremental sizes in between. So, it's obviously possible to maybe, as we can look into in a moment, maybe buy a smaller one, representing very good value. So anyway, the overview of his market is not only that this is a seminal art historical thing. There are numerous opportunities to buy, often at auction. 54 examples of Homage to the Square paintings have been sold at auction since 2022. The lowest price for which was $230,000 for an 18 by 18 inch. That's a 46 square centimeter painting. There's a global reach. The US, Germany, UK and Switzerland are the leading venues or nations for transaction volume. And of course, that gives us a really good snapshot of where the key power in the art market lies. These are the four biggest or most major centers, but distributed worldwide. Of course, he has unimpeachable institutional validation. He's represented in every major museum collection anywhere ever. And there's also a very strong foundation. The Josef and Annie Albers Foundation in Connecticut are very powerful custodians of the work, and in tandem with the sort of partnership with David Zwirner since 2016, they have a very controlled development of the market. I guess another useful overview or way to sort of summarize his appeal. He has an 83% sell-through rate at auction, and probably even some of the failures are down to condition. So almost always sell. And in recent years, over 70% of the auction results have exceeded the high estimate. So this is a very high-performing thing that continues to go from strength to strength.
Good. Thanks, Nick. Do you know how many Albers work sells at auction every year?
Well, I don't know. You're probably going to give me a number that maybe is not reflective of only the Homage to the Square paintings.
No.
Because there are also prints.
Yes.
There are wood blocks. There
Yes.
are other types of paintings and things. I mean, there's a large... I mean, he was an old man when he died and working consistently since 1920. So it was more than half a century of production.
But it's over 200 works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which also is quite a liquid market in terms of that.
Yeah.
Look into it. So what kind of Albers works would you suggest present the best opportunity for collectors?
Well, I've alluded to the fact that there are different sizes. 16 by 16, 18 by 18, 24 inch, 28 inch square, 30 by 30, 32, 40 by 40, 48 inch. Now, if we look at the bigger sizes, we can see that the prices are typically quite high. Anything from sort of 76 centimeters square above tends to achieve a pretty high price. The record price, just as an instructive note, the record price for a 30 by 30 inch painting is $2 million. The record price for a 32 by 32 inch painting which is the overall record price at auction, incidentally, $3 million. 40 by 40, 2.95, and there was a 48 inch square painting sold quite some time ago for 2.2 million. I'm sure it would fetch enormously more than that today. So these are all between $2 and $3 million, 30 by 30 inches and above. But if we look at the record price for a 16 by 16 or an 18 by 18, the record price of these two respectively is 850K and 762K. So there's an enormous discrepancy between the prices that the smaller paintings achieve and the larger paintings achieve. And yet the actual sort of presence of these paintings is not so different. And the kind of experience that they provide is not so different. So my suggestion is that there's a lot of value in the smaller size paintings. And if we break that down even further, we can say that 4 squares are generally more desirable than 3. Some of the paintings, as I mentioned, have 3 nested squares, some 4. So 4, of course, means 1 extra color and all of the sort of extra experiential qualities that you get from 4 colors reacting alongside each other than 3. Some of them have slight variations on the simplicity of the format, where there's some sort of canted corners or some extra lines, where there's a sort of a slight change in the formula, if you will. The simplest format is the best, where none of these sort of extra modifications have been implemented. And then I would say tonality, and by that I mean works that are executed in more or less the same color family tend to have a certain sort of purity about them that are more highly valued by collectors. So if you have a painting, the record painting was actually for a painting that consisted of very warm reds. So it had an incredible sort of pulsating beauty to it. Similarly, very, golden yellows or, very, very rich blues. I mean, all of these kinds of ones would be very, very highly prized. Some of the works have very strange dissonant color combinations. And I think there's actually an interesting opportunity in these works. These are more sort of radical essays in how colors react. For example, there's some that have sort of blues and greens with a sort of strange brown or browny yellow. These are his experiments whereby, the color itself might be yellow, but the presence of the yellow makes the colors alongside it look either blue or green. And so these are also have sometimes a tonality that looks very much of the period, the sort of colors you associate with, I don't know, I'm going to be very crass here and say, bathroom tiles from the 60s or the 70s. So maybe they have a sort of a slightly dated or vintage quality because the palette is redolent of a certain period. Now, I think these are great because, they actually feel very much like they are of their time. Maybe the more expensive ones have a certain universal quality, but maybe these have a certain sort of like period document quality. And I think there's an opportunity in those. Anyway, if we cut to we've given a sort of overview of the record prices, but for all the formats, I'm going to go from the 16 by 16, the lowest price in the last 3 years, 250, 18 by 18, lowest price last 3 years, 230, 30 by 30, lowest 411, 32 by 32, 220. Now don't forget that the 30 by 32, 32 by 32 format, the record price is $3 million. Yet the lowest price in the last 3 years is 220K. Now these are all things that come up at auction. And maybe, there's a bad economy, or maybe there's just, simple a fact as just sort of falling through the gaps in terms of public consciousness. Maybe it's a small provincial auction house somewhere. There are opportunities, but there are also pitfalls. And the things to look out for, of course, the typical things that I've mentioned in terms of the qualitative aspects artistically, but then when you have the same tonal family, it's important that there's a clear distinction between the squares, so you see a clear reaction in the different blocks of color. A good provenance is nice. Of course, the comprehensive annotations on the back are also desirable, but a key thing is condition. Now, some of them have a problematic condition. Albers would paint these paintings, and then sometimes he would varnish them because he would want to see the color before and after varnishing. That would change the way the light hit the surface. It would change the tonality of the color that was underneath the varnish. And this was not a very wise archival choice. This was a choice that he made to see them sort of in the moment without thinking about the sort of longevity of them as objects. So then he would sometimes even paint over the top of the varnish, which you get some of them, you have really bad cracking and peeling, and it's very important to ensure that there hasn't been a lot of restoration, or that it is in a sound condition that will stay sound.
Okay, Nick, so just to be clear, why do we believe it's still underappreciated by the market relative to his high price and cultural importance?
Well, because there are enough of them that you can still snaffle them up for inexpensive prices. I've just given you an overview of the low prices for various size formats in the last 3 years: 250, 230, 220. Almost irrespective of size, you can find these paintings, and these are paintings that their sort of brethren fetch $3 million. It's not such a stretch to feel like, as his market continues to sort of grow, and it's a market that incidentally has just grown steadily over time, over easily 20 years where it's been firmly accepted as part of this sort of pantheon of great art making of the 20th century. So, they're not ever going to be less than that. And as everything else becomes more expensive, maybe these won't radically appreciate, but if you wish to have a very sort of solid blue chip holding, you could reasonably expect that if you get one of these, if you have a $200,000 painting, you'll end up with a $400,000 painting. If you get a $400,000 painting, the least you can reasonably expect is that you'll have a $600,000 painting. Maybe it will take a few years, but it's a very safe, solid, risk-averse thing to put money into, and a very iconic thing to enjoy as you do so.
Yes, and we have also been buying and offering, advising clients with private works from Josef Albers that have never been on auctions.
Yes, that's true. I mean, they can be found. And the thing too, I guess, is key is that the auction market and the private market also represents an opportunity relative to the works that Zwirner has, either from the foundation or works that he sources. I mean, he will sell a 76 square centimeter painting, for it's more than $1 million, 1.2, $1.4 million. I mean, are some recent prices that I've seen with works by him. And I've seen similar works that have been possible to acquire on the private market for 8, 9, 950, less than $1 million. So, it's doable.
So, Nick, this has been quite a long episode, but I also think we will made a deep dive into his life, which was quite important to understand how an important figure he is. Any final thoughts? Anything you think is worth mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information about Albers. They have a very nice, the Albers Foundation has a really nice website which gives so much information on the. It sort of adds vitality to the information, if you like, where you can see a lot of timelines and archival information in the life of the Albers. It's very really really beautiful. But the conclusion generally is that I guess the market narrative is that it's a very stable market. It's not a speculative market. It's highly suited to a sort of strategic holding. So it's ideal for very committed long-term collectors, people that want to see their art as a very solid repository of cash, of liquidity. obviously something that you can put money into that has incredible cultural depth and resonance for the entire sort of history of 20th century art production, and very strong financial fundamentals underpinning the kind of commitment to these works. So it's very relevant for those who want to allocate some capital towards this sort of legacy modernism that will never lose its high status within the art world.
So if anybody want to acquire it, they can look at auction. They can, of course, write David Schwinner. They can call us as well.
Yes, yeah, there's lots of...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I guess that's all for us this time.
Yeah. I think we've done as much as we can.
Good. Bye.
Bye-bye.
That was it for this episode of The Collector's Edge. If you are looking for expert insights, want to make informed decisions, and would like advice from independent advisors, send us an email or maybe just call us. You can find all the info on our website, nordicartpartners.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope to have you back for another episode. Bye.